Okay, we continue our day of Decision Camp, and our next presenter is Chris Berg, who is the Director of Product Strategy and Design at inrule, another well-known vendor of business rule software. And this is the second time Chris presents on Decision Camps, and I notice that he likes to call his presentations good beginnings, and it's quite interesting. And this year he's talking about another beginning related to problem discovery and stating goals. And I want you to pay attention to the word problem, not rules discovery, but problem discovery. It's probably a much more generic approach, and Chris always has a very interesting perspective. Chris, please take over.
Well, thank you very much. It's really good to be here. And I really believe in this topic, everyone. I've been working with teams for a good number of years. And while it's really interesting to talk about all the intricacies of our decision making and our automation, it's really the beginning of the project that we see a lot of problems taking place. And I talked about this last year as we introduced the concepts of what good beginnings really are and what are the practices that we can use to unstick a team and really accelerate the automation that's about to take place. And last year I introduced a customer, an insurance company that was in the Midwest, and they were stuck in the integration phases where they thought, well, we need to prototype our integration. And they continued in this perpetual POC because they felt that integration was their biggest risk, when in fact what we learned by the end of that session was that they really hadn't paid attention to these other risks. They didn't know what goals they wanted to achieve. They didn't know how to engage with the business and the strategic initiatives that were underway from their leadership. And there were a lot of assumptions that were made that frankly just were not correct, or when they did surface, there was no mitigation strategy around them. So what this session is about today is really, how does a team bootstrap itself? How do you get those, get the foundation of the team together and baseline everyone on exactly what we're going to do together, and not just how we're going to do it, but more importantly, why are we going to work together on this project? What do we believe together? And then let everything else orient around that. So this is really the fundamental practices that a team can use to get started and interact with their stakeholders. Now, last year I introduced the concept of an instrument, and this is a readiness instrument that we use with our customers. And when we begin with a project, we try and get them to dialogue internally, and then later as part of the project, what they think is about to happen. And we cover all the areas here of leadership, stakeholders, you know, who looks like a rule author, really interesting things. But at the end of the day, when we start getting into some of the team building activities and what we're going to do together, you start seeing things fall off real quickly, that the team doesn't really have agreement on what's about to happen. And that's okay at the beginning of a project. But what I think is really interesting is that when we measure, do we think we know what the problem is? What we've discovered is that everyone is quick to say, yeah, we know what we're doing. We are all looking at a star. But by the time the project begins, that's when we realize everyone is looking at a different star and not oriented towards the same star. And so that's really what this session is about, is how do we get everyone to agree on the problem? And most importantly, how do we know that we've uncovered all of the problems that we need to tackle? Because if we're going to do this automation, let's not just do it as well as it used to be. We don't want to just replace code. We don't want to just make the process digital and not improve it and not improve the lives of the people that are involved with it. So what we're really going to do is point everyone at the same time to the North Star. And I know this is a reference for our hemisphere of the planet. So sorry, folks, you know, in other parts of the world where they don't see the North Star, but I'm using that as our point of orientation. But basically, you know, we ask ourselves, you know, finding that North Star, we start to ask, what's the cost of a team that's lost its way? And we measure that cost in terms of, it's not just one person, but if there's 10, 15 people on this team, what's the cost of them spinning for a couple of weeks? What's the cost of being on the wrong problem, especially when it's not aligned with strategic initiatives? What's the cost of not knowing the why or being able to tell the story when they're interacting with a stakeholder and they can't quickly say why this project is underway or why is this project going off the rails? Because of its missed orientation. And finally, what's the cost of any team not knowing what the practices are to bootstrap themselves and to orient around the problems that they're going to tackle together? So all of these are in play when we're thinking about that North Star. So why is this so hard? It seems like it should be easy, right? It seems like it's pretty straightforward when in fact it's not. And it's full of familiar stuff, but it's not quite put together in a way that makes sense to everybody if we just rely on the individual. So what we find is these journeys, these digital transformation journeys, they span teams and processes. And when you talk about negative effects, not everybody has the right kind of empathy for what is taking place because we look at it from our silo or our part of the organization. But there are many cultures within the same organization, different ways to value things, and that can get in the way of baselining the team. There's also working assumptions that just never get shared. Even when people tell a story and they come to a conclusion, folks will make an emotional assumption that people get that the problem hurts, when in fact they might not be having an emotional response at all. They just heard some words. They haven't really felt the pinch or the suffering that's coming from the words of someone else on the team. And of course, there's just different levels of analysis that need to take place, different dimensions about what's happening in these scenarios, different interactions between people and APIs. And something that just gets in the way a lot too is that teams are so busy executing, they're just not spending enough time thinking. And they need to just stop doing and get together, and they need to think together. And maybe you know, by the time they bootstrap around these problems, they'll realize that maybe they needed a better cadence of thinking together as they're tackling these digital transformation problems. And then finally, if there's no agreement on what the problem should be, you know, if no one is interacting with the stakeholders, then the engine is free spinning from the transmission. The clutch is not engaged on the flywheel, and we can't really get the traction and the business impact that we're hoping for. So if we can't get that agreement, we're not really helping the operational problems of the organization. So we must absolutely be interacting with our stakeholders, and they must be part of this process all along so we can orient to what's strategic. So I want to introduce another company that we've been working with. So now we're transitioning to a company that manages a fleet of vehicles. And now I've sanitized this in a couple of ways, but I think that there's enough meat here for us to describe how we got the team to talk about their journey and how to describe it in so many different ways that it helped everyone understand all the nuances that was taking place. Now we know from the very beginning with this organization that their leadership had already been asking big questions about some of their operational problems. One of them was just simply 9 to 11 million calls a year into the call center. And that's a lot of phone calling. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of pressure on the organization from a people, salary, customer interaction point of view. And as they're looking at what they want to be doing strategically and how can they scale, the obvious things come to mind, which is why is everybody calling the call center? What are the top calls that are coming in? How do we relieve ourselves and how can we scale if we've got all these calls coming in? And that on its own isn't really rocket science. There's well-known reasons why people call in, but they did pick a couple to start on, which is, let's think about why folks are calling in. Can we use self-service as part of our digital transformation to relieve this call volume? And can we just try and eliminate that? And what would happen? What would the world be like if we could do something like that? So those were kind of the broad orientations coming from their leadership and from their stakeholders. It was very high level. It's like, yes, we think that, we have an assumption, a working assumption, that if we engaged drivers as the key persona and not fleet managers, that in fact, something could be done to relieve the call volumes that were coming in into the call center. And what's really interesting is that's pretty much the framework that the team was handed. They knew that they were going to create some kind of mobile app and mobile experience. They weren't going to boil the ocean, but they knew that this application was going to have multiple capabilities over time, but we were just going to start simply with one reason why folks are coming in to the call center. And so what we started to do was we got to the whiteboard and we started asking the big questions. Well, why is everybody calling in for their why are drivers calling in? It turns out, well, it's quite often around some kind of fuel card, or they lost their card, they reached a daily limit. There were all kinds of reasons why folks needed to reorder their card. And most of them were valid, some were not, but the fact is that these are all the reasons, and that was helpful to understand that. And so we said, okay, great. Let's go through the problems that we think we have right now with this process. And folks are pretty quick to identify, we just don't know what's going on. We just don't have any awareness about what's going on through this process. And so we said, great, let's journey map this onto a whiteboard. And so that's what we did. So in the first step, we got everyone together. How does this thing start? Well, it starts with a call or an email, the driver's calling in, and the customer service person is acting as a proxy for the transaction, and they're actually doing the work on behalf of the driver. And we realized pretty quickly that in the next step, there's this pre-processing step where the call center is doing work, validating, are there limits on the card that we're ordering? Do they have a valid address? Is there some issue going on with the vehicle? Sometimes they're aware enough that, oh, is this the second or third request coming in from this driver? And then once they've established this context, then they engage in some kind of transaction with a vendor to order the card. So there's an API call. And as we're going through this, we're asking questions like, well, how long does that take to go from the inbound call to, validating all this information, to making an interaction with the vendor via an API? And we start getting these timelines down, and no one at the time was even aware of what the full cycle time was for the card reorder. So as we stand here together mapping this out, we start understanding, oh, well, there's another couple of days here, another couple of days there. And 3 days later, we stumble onto another decision, which looks like, how do we deliver this card? How do we select the shipper? Do we understand all the financial constraints in regard to policies around shipping? And then finally, once that card is ordered, then things would fall off a cliff in terms of, we don't know what's happening. Now the driver thinks something has happened. They have no idea what's going on. They have no notifications, no sense of what's happening. And if they're not aware of what's happened, they may not be looking for the card that's come to them. Maybe they lost it. And when that happens, if they don't have awareness to be looking for something, it gets lost. It's never activated. And this is where we get the recursion in the process, where they call again, and they'll call again and again, feeding into this loop of, I didn't get my card, and building frustration, what's going on with the drivers. So working with the team, we're quickly able to identify what's going on. What are the things that need to happen? And I challenged the team and my colleague together. We challenged them to come back and say, hey, if we're going to improve this process, what are the things that we've never done before? What would take this from being just another repeat of the process to something that's really ideal? And so that's where these stars come in, and we ask them to just mark, if we're going to go after this automation, let's mark the things that we really want to happen to make this awesome. And so that's what we did. So we're like, hey, we've never really been able to enforce reorder limits, or we've never been able to really understand quickly what's going on with the status of a vehicle at the time that this process is operating. They've never had awareness over, was that the second or third attempt? Drivers have never had notifications, and even call center folks have never had notifications, and no one has ever tracked the cycle time for this process. And so, and what's really interesting too is if everyone agreed that, hey, let's get rid of this repeat, can we knock this down? So maybe we should be tracking improvement based on the failed activation rates. What can we track in the cycle time, those parts of the cycle time that we can control, because some they can't because it's going to a third party. And then what's the overall impact on calls per year coming into the call center? If we're going to be successful with this, how are we going to influence that? And this really set the team up to understand there's a lot going on here. We have a general frame of reference now, and now we know the real candidates of features that we want to go after, and we're working through some of the assumptions down here as we go through some of these insights. And what's interesting about the insights is we start seeing certain risks pop up, like, what if the drivers don't install the mobile app? What are the other assumptions we have that could really get in the way of us being successful if we tackle this journey and improvement? So to help with that, we follow some practices from Lean UX that really helps pull assumptions out of a team quickly. So we get everybody together with the whiteboard, and myself or a colleague will be working with the team, and we'll go through two kinds of assumptions. Now they all have Post-it notes and Sharpies, and they quickly are writing these down. I start asking questions like, on the business assumptions, we believe our customer, or this persona, the driver, has a need to do X. That if we did this, our initial customers would be X, or our we'll make more money, or we'll have a better process if we do X. The primary competition, could be another process that they're competing with internally, but what is their competition? What's their biggest risk? And what's really important is what assumptions do we have if proven false will cause our project to fail. Really trying to get at those business issues, you know, including how we make money, are we properly justifying this? And then on the user assumption side, because now we're working with a persona driver that they've never worked with before, we've got some assumptions. Do we really understand who that person is? Do we know what really motivates them? So we're asking questions, who is that user? Where does this product or this capability that we're imagining, where does this fit in their life? Does it really solve their problem? So we're trying to get at desirability. Do they really desire that capability? And if we do it, is it going to work? And how will they behave? Do we have an idea of what should the product do and look like in a way to get the behavior from the persona that we're after? So we do this real quick. We go for 15, 20 minutes on assumptions, and then we put these on a board in a grid and really map them out between known and unknown assumptions, and which assumptions might be high risk and low risk. And we're going to orient the team around those risks and those assumptions that are high and unknown. We're going to incorporate that with our planning and make sure that those risks have a mitigation strategy. So when we're coming back to the stakeholders and we're talking about what we're going to do with this project, we're also going to package up the high risks that are unknown, and we're going to package that with mitigation strategies for the team. So now we've gone from, we understand the journey, we're really starting to understand the problems that we're going to solve. We've tried to come to terms with our working assumptions as a group. And we're assuming there's a lot of diversity in this group, so everyone's starting to hear the empathy from each other. And then in the next step, what we're going to do is start stating the problem together. And this is our first step of orienteering, because whenever you orient, you are somewhere. This is your point of departure. So when you're stating the problem, you're basically stating the world as it is. And we're given this format from Lean UX where we can just simply write this out together as a team. Well, our original system was designed for, in this case, fleet managers, and it was designed with these goals in mind. The assumption one, that fleet managers were able to keep up with card reorders, or that they were able to manage the group of people that they're tasked with managing. And we believe that they could do that and do it in a way that wouldn't have an impact on our business. But what we've observed is that our current approach to this problem is not meeting those goals, because what we've observed is that we still have high calls into the call center, that folks are getting upset by the interactions that they're having, that there's no measurement occurring in the process. We didn't even know what the cycle time was, and that there is some measurable cost back to the organization. Now it's up to the team to decide, will they put a dollar value on the cost, but they could just simply count people, which is another way of doing cost. But there is a reasonable impact to the business. And once they've done this, this is the world as it is. And it's a great way to state what kind of hellhole they're in terms of where they need to go from, and how do they imagine the world that is to become. And this is the point where we're stating the North Star. So we've had a very clear statement of why this process is broken. We understand what the journey is currently, but now we need to believe. We need to believe that what we're about to do together is going to make a big difference for those drivers. And we believe that those drivers will have a better experience if, one, they could just do the work themselves. If they just went to the mobile app and ordered the card when they needed it, wouldn't that be great? And along the way, if they could understand what's happening, and that they could get notifications along the way, and that would just be a great experience for them. And we also believe that by measuring this, we'll reduce calls into the call center by X%. And we're going to accomplish this within 12 weeks. And that's important to say when, or the time frame that we're going to use to accomplish this task. And we're going to do this by doing a couple of things. One, we're going to get we're going to get everyone to agree that we're all full-time on this. There won't be any part-timers. We're going to go 12 weeks, break it up into sprints, and we're going to measure our progress, as we execute this project together. And when we're done, we're going to understand almost immediately what the impacts will be once we've delivered the capability into the organization. And that's the North Star. So you can imagine now that you're putting a presentation together, or you're working with someone in the organization, and they have a very succinct point of view about what they're going to do, the time frame, the value, and that's exactly what stakeholders want to hear. If there's going to be an investment, they want to understand all that framing, which frankly is very difficult for a lot of sponsors of these kinds of projects, because they're often flowing through the enterprise architecture teams, or they're flowing through technical teams who maybe aren't practiced enough to be talking like this and packaging up what they're going to do for the investment. And they really have baselined the team now, and everyone believes in the world that's about to become. Now, there's additional steps that can be taken at this time, especially if we're going to separate some of the work between those who are going to work on the mobile app and those that are going to work on the decision management side on the automation front for business logic. So we can extend that storytelling into DMN, and we can say, hey, we know that this team here that's focused on the decision management aspects, we can identify those decisions now that we want to go after and scope that along with the work that'll be done with the mobile app. So we can come back to our journey map. We've already identified here that there's probably a decision candidate here. And we can start breaking it down. We can call it pre-processing, because that's what we put in the journey map. We know that there might be an order limit that could be some kind of decision. Maybe there have been some recent orders, or it's been a reorder, and there might be some approval, including some limits that are tied to that decision. And as we're doing this, we're also dialoguing a little bit about data, like what data do I need to support that decision? Well, we know we got customers involved, we got drivers, orders, and we may even have vendors involved. And then the second decision is also identified, the point of delivery. So we can go ahead and model that. We understand that we're going to make a delivery, but there could be some restrictions in terms of the vendors that we're going to use to order those cards. There could be some configuration or system defaults, but they largely share the inputs into that decision that we have with the first decision. Now, if you've gone through training with James Taylor and you're thinking about concrete, making everything concrete and unambiguous, these are very high level inputs at the entity level and not at the field level. So we know there's still work to do with these models. We're just painting a high level picture on these models, and we know that there's work for the team to do to go back and touch up those models. What we're trying to do here is just kind of orient at a very high level the modeling work that still needs to be done. And then we're also identifying from the journey map, who's the owner? Well, it's going to be the mobile team. What are the KPIs that are going to be in place for this project? And that team, when they're ready, they're going to be off and running. They're going to finish that modeling exercise, and they're going to keep going. So what we're doing, we're reinforcing that North Star with DMN and modeling, and we're going to be able to say, hey, we know what we're doing. We know what the mobile app is going to do. We've already established some of the boundaries for the decision management portion, and we're going to be off and running. So this is all reinforcing that North Star, and we're storytelling. We're storytelling with DMN and reinforcing what the team understands together. But there's still a missing piece, and that missing piece is the emotion that is tied to the world as it is. And if we don't fully understand that, we'll never really understand the power of the transformation that this team and others are going to go through. It's suffering. It's the suffering that people are going through. And so I think it's important for the team to tell these stories together to really bring about the human drama of what's taking place. So one day, Anna came to work at the call center, and just last week she's been called twice by the same driver for a new fuel card. And that driver exclaimed, "It never received the fuel card." Moreover, following their calls, he had no notifications that anyone or any process was in play to deliver what was needed. And in desperation, he just kept calling. And today, Anna's feeling the heat just when she was looking forward to a regular day because her cat's at the vet with a serious infection. And now this driver can't fuel up. He can't fuel up with his card. He's upset. He might have to use his own money and submit an expense report. Ugh, who likes that? He just wants to get stuff done. He just wants to drive. And now no one is happy. And you know what? That problem is going to happen over and over and over and just amp up the drama. So Anna starts looking for job openings on LinkedIn. But what if the world that we imagined was something quite a bit different? What if one day Anna came into work at the call center and she was really worried about her cat at the vet that day, but you know what? She had a great day. Most of the calls were things she wanted to help with, interesting problems that needed research. And for the first time in a long time, she had time to formulate thoughtful solutions. In fact, she lost track of time and she didn't even obsess over Kitty. And at the end of the day, her supervisor asked about fuel card orders in flight. And, in a pinch, she ran a report from a dashboard. Call volumes down 30%. NPS scores up. Customers happily stuck to their vendor. Customer service team retained 98% of their staff in the last 12 months and didn't need to hire with a rush of new clients. Repeat orders and lost cards down to just 1%. Now, whether or not the team believes this will happen, that's up to them, but it does get them imagining a world that once changed would be very hard to go back. And no one wants to live in the previous world. And if they understand this, the emotional impact, it's going to be a big motivator for folks. And in fact, there's a lot of theory behind this. And one of the ways that cultural transformation happens is just everyone finding themselves in that drama, in that emotional drama. We find ourselves in the story. We understand why everything is happening, and it starts to change our behavior. We start planning and thinking and hoping, and we start imagining that, if we deliver this, the world will never be the same again. And there's a lot of theory behind this. Peter Berger and Luckman, they wrote a text in the 60s, Sociology of Knowledge. It's called The Social Construction of Reality. And what they were theorizing is essentially that if we imagine something simply by telling the story, it can become real. It can become objectivized or objective reality because it begins to change our behavior. We start acting as though that thing exists in the real world. And if you think about it, the things that we imagine take on the nature of the real simply because it's creating this feedback loop for us, and we start acting around it. We start reinforcing it. And the change starts to occur in such a way that we just can't imagine the world behind it. So storytelling and finding the North Star are just absolutely critical to helping people understand the change that's taking place. And everyone, I believe that this technology that we have is a fundamental game changer when it comes to changing the lives of people. And I've believed this for years, and I think all the different ways that we can tell stories and uncover problems and talk about them are really going to make a dramatic difference in our activities. And so I urge all of us as practitioners, let's think deeply and technically, but let's also think about the human drama and the help that we're going to bring to those that might be suffering. And that's it.
Chris, thank you so much. That was a really insightful presentation and really resonated with me, because I always although my background is in engineering, I like to make sure we're doing that link between the technology and what people do in their, in their day-to-day life and what the objectives of the organization are. And it really looks like you're using these information gathering and storytelling mechanisms to help figure out if an organization is doing the right thing rather than doing the thing right. This isn't really specific to decision modeling. It's definitely something that I've spent a lot of time with on, but you've put kind of a DMN twist on it by linking from that journey model or the journey map to decision models. Do you think that DMN has really provided a boost here in the gathering assumptions and stating the problem, or is this really just more about the social aspect of understanding people's real problems and how they fit into things?
Well, I think DMN is really malleable for discovery. I think folks know this about me. I love annotations. It's like I could do a lot with those. And essentially, when you think about what you can do with DMN, you can put a lot of big questions out there, and it can be used for all kinds of discovery. Is it as helpful as a journey map? And at what point would you be better off, discovering a process if you're going to be in BPMN? There's lots of ways to get started, but I like activities that start with the team and that are less digital. That we're on a whiteboard, we're all together and we're interacting in a tactile way. I really like that, but I do believe that DMN can do more on the discovery side. Mm-hmm. And I love the clean handoff between what folks are going to do. And I think DMN really facilitates that well, especially imagine if I didn't have a journey map and I had a BPMN diagram. I'd be doing the same thing. I'd be handing off part of the process model into DMN, and I see the same thing happening with journey mapping.
Right. And I'm not sure if you were able to join yesterday, but there was a good presentation by Charlotte, who's one of James Taylor's colleagues, on decision modeling as a requirements capture sort of mechanism. And I think that there's certainly some synergies between what you're talking about and what she was talking about. And, as you know, I'm from the process side. So I was like, well, how do we deal with process models and decision models? And what does that look like when we're dealing with both? And from what I see from yours, starting with the journey map, which is a little bit of whether it doesn't matter whether it's BPMN or not, which is a little bit process oriented, and then kind of driving some of the decisions out of that, gives you the best of both worlds during that capture phase. Is that a correct assessment?
Absolutely. We don't know what technology we're going to use yet.
Sure.
And what's interesting is we're not working with BPM at this point. It's going to be a mobile app where it's going to be this. And so once we start telling the story more and more and refining it, then we start saying, oh, we can show that in a model, or we can. So I like the journey map because it's not technology dependent, but it has a lot of rich information, which leads to richer models. And I find it as a key accelerator.
Right. And it's Alan Fish just added a comment on Slack and saying definitely he agrees that DMN, or at least the DRD, was originally a discovery tool and can be used for all sorts of discovery beyond just strict decision modeling.
Yeah, I agree.
So if anybody else has a question, you can put the question on
yes.
Slack or raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Can I ask a question? Chris, yesterday we had a panel of vendors, and because you represent an essential vendor in this space, could you just briefly answer questions what Sandy asked yesterday, people, what's new on your product and what is the most exciting use cases you have? It would be interesting to hear this.
So the two questions I had kind of started with on the panel is, what's the most interesting use case that you've seen over the last year or so? Because I think we've gone through periods of amazing change over this last 18 months. And just is there one that kind of stands out there? And then, you know, anything about product capabilities that are coming up as well.
Yes, so I'll just say briefly that I'm surprised by all the different places where folks want to run a decision. I mean, it's, you know, I have seen decisions run inside of, you know, mobile apps, inside of stored procedures, and inside of Snowflake UDFs. You know, I think what is surprising to me is just all the different places where folks want to run automation. And you know, for years I've talked about multi-channel benefits of what we do, but it just keeps growing. The ecosystem just keeps growing, and it's shocking sometimes just where folks show up and say, "Hey, we want to run here." So I think that has been, I mean, even just this year, I think has been pretty interesting. I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Just about any new kind of capabilities that you're bringing into the product that might be sort of addressing some of this transformation that we've gone through, or disruption that we've gone through, I should say.
So we have been making a lot of investment in DMN of late. So we are members of DecisionAutomation.org, which we'll be hearing from Ryan Trollope and Jan later, I believe later today.
Yeah, in an hour.
Yeah, so we've been very interested in making sure that DMN is a part of our story. And as you can tell from our good beginnings point of view, this is something we really believe in. We believe that a couple of things, but we think DMN is going to really help business users. And we believe that digital transformation will begin with the business quite often. And the more tools that we can bring to the table to help folks discover, we're all going to be successful. I think it's going to really help our space, and we're going to do what we can to help with that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate
it. All right.
It.
If there's no other questions, I think that's it. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you.